to be convicted as terrorists on no evidence at all is frankly outrageous. It can only have been for political reasons.
A dark day for press freedom. A court in Egypt sentences Al Jazeera journalists to at least 3 years in prison. But was this a political trial? And should journalists be locked up for simply doing their job? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. For Canadian Mohamed Fahmy, Egyptian Baher Mohamed and Australian Peter Greste, justice has been denied again. In a retrial widely criticised and condemned by the White House, the EU and the United Nations, a guilty verdict. The Cairo court sentenced the Al Jazeera journalist to at least 3 years in prison. Peter Greste, who was tried in absentia and deported to Australia, will avoid imprisonment. 6 other Al Jazeera journalists have been convicted in absentia. The verdict has been described as a deliberate attack on press freedom. This is some of what the judge had to say.
The court is quite sure that the defendants are not journalists and are not in the journalist syndicate. The defendants have devices for broadcasting without permits. The defendants have made falsified videos after being edited and aired on Al Jazeera. And they air these videos on Al Jazeera channel that isn't allowed to work inside Egypt.
Well, Al Jazeera held a press conference Saturday where the acting managing director addressed each of the Egyptian judges' points.
Firstly, there is no evidence proving that our colleagues in any way fabricated news. This was comprehensively debunked by the court's own technical committee. Secondly, we were not broadcasting in Egypt to Egyptians. Therefore, we did not require a broadcasting license. Thirdly, the judge said that our colleagues were not journalists. They emphatically are journalists. The court cannot wish away the fact that these 3 men don't have a long-standing track record and a distinguished body of work. They emphatically were journalists, and they are journalists. They spent over a year in prison, enduring psychological torment and solitary confinement at times. That torment now continues. Today's verdict is yet another deliberate attack on press freedom. It's a dark day for the Egyptian judiciary.
Well, Peter Greste was deported from Egypt in February and retried in absentia. He said he's shocked and outraged by the court's decision.
We did nothing wrong. The court presented no evidence, the prosecution presented no evidence that we did anything wrong. And so for us to be convicted as terrorists on no evidence at all is frankly outrageous. It can only have been for political reasons. The fact is that this is a wrong. This is unjust. This is unethical. This is immoral at so many levels. This cannot be allowed to stand. And so we will do everything we can to fight the verdict, to clear our names. We are not terrorists. We did not collude with any organisation. We did not broadcast any false news. And so at every level, both in terms of the liberty of my colleagues, in terms of my name, the names of all of us, we have to keep fighting.
Well, before I bring in our guests, let's take a quick look back at how the case has unfolded. Niamh Barker has this report.
3 Al Jazeera journalists had hoped this verdict would mark the end of a long ordeal. So did all their colleagues, as well as other journalists and defenders of free speech. It began in December 2013 when reporter Peter Greste and producers Mohamed Fahmy and Baher Mohamed were arrested and charged with aiding the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood. They spent more than a year in a Cairo jail, punctuated by brief and confusing appearances in court in which they protested their innocence. Legal experts said the trial was a farce. It provoked an outpouring of solidarity amongst journalists around the world who protested in support of the Al Jazeera 3. But that didn't stop the court from convicting them, as well as 6 other colleagues in absentia, sentencing them to several years in imprisonment, a verdict that provoked international outrage.
The issue of the Al Jazeera journalists in Egypt We've been clear both publicly and privately that they should be released.
Eventually, Egypt's Court of Cassation overturned the verdict and ordered a retrial. Diplomatic pressure did pay off for Peter Greste, released earlier this year. He made an emotional return to his native Australia. But this retrial has cast a shadow over him, no matter how implausible the accusation.
Remember, there was no more evidence that the prosecutor was able to present in this trial that wasn't in the first. And so it's quite clear that we were not involved with any of the things that the prosecutor has accused us of. We weren't involved with terrorism. We had no connections with the Muslim Brotherhood beyond the work of normal journalists. We did not broadcast any false news.
Meanwhile, Mohamed Fahmy and Baha Mohamed had been released on bail. For Baha, it was a chance to make up for lost time with a young family. Speaking before this latest verdict, he said his struggle was part of a greater battle for freedom of expression.
I don't hope anything. I'm just living day by day. And I think Peter will understand this. I'm just living day by day. I don't hope anything. I don't expect anything. I know that I will continue the fight even if I was acquitted or not. I will continue the fight for press freedom and for those journalists who are still behind bars, who are in desperate need for our support and help.
Mohamed Fahmy says he's a victim of Egypt's poor relations with Qatar, home of Al Jazeera. He's taking legal action against Al Jazeera, accusing it of negligence, a charge the network strongly denies. It says that it will carry on fighting for the Al Jazeera 3 and for the other Al Jazeera employees who were convicted in absentia in the original trial. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera.
Well, let us now get the thoughts of our guests. In Washington, D.C., Sherif Mansour, Middle East and North Africa Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists. In London, Sue Turton, former Al Jazeera correspondent and one of those convicted in absentia. Welcome to you both. Let's begin with you, Sue. What is your immediate response to this outrageous verdict?
I think I was shocked as any other journalist who's been watching this case, Mike. And particularly because I did speak to both Baha and was in touch with Mohamed Fahmy earlier this morning before the actual verdict took place. And although none of us was saying openly that we were optimistic, I think all of us really did believe that Egypt would do the right thing and they would recognise yet again that there was no evidence to support the convictions, no evidence to support the claims, and that perhaps they wouldn't be acquitted because that would be a change of face for Egypt, but at least they would be given time served and they'd be walking out of that courtroom door.
Well, 2 of them are going to prison, but for the other 7 of you who've been convicted in absentia, it must be made clear that this is going to have a major impact on your lives, is it not?
I think that's the other I suppose, byproduct of this verdict today is that it's now very clear to me that Egypt is not about to recognise that my own conviction should be reconsidered. It's not about to quash my own conviction and my 10-year sentence that I suppose I'm on the run for. And so that's not going to go away either. And as you say, it's now become very difficult for Peter Greste, for myself, for Dominic Kane, one of the other reporters who's also convicted in absentia. It's almost difficult, very, very difficult now for us to travel and to carry on doing our jobs, which is why I stepped down from my role as correspondent, because even in places like Europe, we are not even sure that we are safe to go in and out of airports. We're not even sure that we might not be detained because this has happened to some of our colleagues.
Well, we'll return to a couple of those points in a moment, but Sherif Mansour, this is a dark and dismal day for journalism around the world, is it not?
Absolutely. It's an official criminalization of legitimate journalism work, and it touches not only on Al Jazeera, every journalist who works in Egypt and outside of Egypt. Basically, it's a precedent for Egyptian journalists, but also for bad news for up to 22 journalists, according to our most recent count, who currently are in jail in Egypt. Many of them are accused with very similar charges, and we were hoping that they will be released either with a verdict or with a verdict from the higher court, the Court of Cassation. It's also a contradiction to Egypt's own constitution that says journalists should not be punished because of what they publish. It's a contradiction for the Egypt's own higher Court of Cassation, which already in February said that this case should be put on trial again because there was no evidence and there was no need for those journalists to be convicted. So it's now we're back to square one, and I think now it's up to the Court of Cassation to immediately repeal this verdict and acquit all the people charged and convicted in the trial, and up to President al-Sisi, who earlier said that he is willing to pardon those who are on the case, and I think it's time that he delivers on his promise on that regard.
Well, let's just pause here. The press has never been truly free in Egypt, but the whole situation has deeply worsened in recent years. In June 2012, Mohamed Morsi became president. That's when the Carnegie Media Center says a new wave of attacks on media freedom began. In 2013, Reporters Without Borders downgraded Egypt on its World Press Freedom Index. Later that year, the army removed Morsi from power after mass protests demanding his resignation. Hours later, several pro-Morsi TV channels were shut down. In December, the Muslim Brotherhood was outlawed and 3 Al Jazeera journalists were arrested on false charges of supporting the group. In June, Al Jazeera Arabic reporter Abdullah El-Shami was released after 10 months in jail without charge. The same month, our journalists Peter Greste, Mohamed Fahmy and Baher Mohammed were sentenced to between 7 and 10 years. The Committee to Protect Journalists conducted a prison census last month. They say at least 10 journalists are behind bars, the highest in the country since the group recording began data in 1990. Well, Sharif Mansour, what can be done at this particular point? Is international pressure enough to try and resolve the situation, do you believe?
I think international pressure should continue, and it's already have managed to get the government on several occasions to intervene and try and resolve the case. We have Peter Greste outside of Egypt because of international pressure, and we have now a law that can be used in order to get Mohamed Fahmy outside of Egypt deported with the same way that Peter Greste was deported because of international pressure. And I think the pardoning is something that is already been gained with international pressure, that now it's about time that the international community, including policymakers, including public opinion, should pressure President al-Sisi to deliver on that promise that he legally can fulfill, and he has no reason not to do right now. I think the pressure also can help in many ways unite journalists in Egypt if there was pressure from inside, specifically from the syndicate of journalists, because they too are being touched with this wrong verdict. The judge said today that the journalists are not journalists because they are not registered with or being part of the syndicate, and that's something the Egyptian syndicate have been pushing against for several months now in other cases, and they have said publicly that membership in the syndicates is not the only reason why we would consider someone a journalist.
Well, let me go, if I may, Sharif. Can I go to Sue Turton on this particular point? We're mentioning some of the statements made by the judge. Now, in a way, he moved away from the initial charges that you're all supporting a banned organization and focused on whether or not you were journalists. Within his opinion now, he stated, no, you are not journalists. We've had mention there of the Egyptian syndicate. He said that you were not members of the Egyptian Journalist Syndicate. Anybody who's worked in Egypt knows that the only members of the syndicate can be Egyptian nationals, number one, who work in the print media, number two. Now, the judge either ignored or pushed aside these particular points and put very finely indeed, these are lies which would appear to demolish any shred of judicial integrity. Your view?
I think in the end, Mike, he wasn't really addressing the international stage when he came out with these comments. He was addressing the Egyptian people. This wasn't really for the international media to take away and look at, because we all know exactly what you just said. We know that it wasn't for us to register as broadcast journalists in a newspaper syndicate. That has nothing to do with us. It's a local syndicate, as you say. So that was a bit of a red herring, to be honest. But let's look right back at the original trial when they accused us of not having proper accreditation. And of course, we didn't have proper accreditation because all those weeks and months after the coup, it was chaos in Egypt. It was impossible to operate in a normal environment because all the authorities were all over the place, and even some of the forms that were put in were never actually dealt with. So the idea that we didn't have the proper paperwork, fair enough, we didn't. But I tell you now, so many journalists have said to me since those charges came up that they also didn't. Jon Snow, a towering broadcaster in British television who works for Channel 4 News, said to me he went into Egypt without proper accreditation. BBC journalists have told me they were in and out without proper accreditation. And when it comes down to it, even without proper accreditation, that's a misdemeanor. That's something you should get a fine for, or even thrown out of the country. It's not something that you get to prison, sent to prison for a minute, never mind years and years. So the idea that this is something that is a reason for giving the guys 3 years in prison is utter craziness. And it's a disgrace, to be honest, to have used that as some kind of reason. You know, and I think the other journalists that sat in court and listened to that all threw their hands in the air and said, come on, you've got to look at proper evidence here. This isn't proper evidence. And just to talk a little bit about credibility, I mean, Peter and I have worked in television news for over 25 years. You only have to Google our names and you'll come up with all the kind of journalism we've done for all sorts of different channels, not just Al Jazeera, over the years. And to turn around and say that the people on this charge sheet, the people who is now sent back to prison, aren't proper journalists, it's absolute rubbish.
Well, Sharif Mansour, I think a very important point to stress here, and I know that those in prison would want it stressed too, as indeed those are being convicted in absentia. You mentioned the fact that this is not an isolated incident. There are thousands of people in Egypt who are being put into prison jails, into prison cells, on the same outrageous systems of justice where there are clearly flaws within the judicial system. This is part of the wider picture that I think on this day we should focus on too, should we not?
Absolutely. I think the Egyptian government have given itself a blank order to just use the banner of fighting terrorism to outlaw and to go after anyone that challenges them, any voice that's critical or independent. And they were not shy of enforcing direct censorship against a lot of channels, including some that are opposed to the government, some that are even close to or loyal to the governments. We've seen recently that several of those newspapers who've been supportive of President al-Sisi have been shut down in the print house. And there was, according to our count, at least 7 TV channels who were directly shut down by the government when they ousted former President Morsi. We also, in our count, I want to correct this because the most recent count we did, it was 22 journalists that are held in custody behind bars. Many of them were already indicted and convicted, including for life sentences for very similar charging of joining the Muslim Brotherhood and having a relationship or with the Brotherhood, membership with the Brotherhood, or connection to terrorism acts. And this is something that even President al-Sisi have propagated in his messaging all over the time, is that he doesn't accept anyone to have a different opinion. And he said that to editors, and a lot of those editors have actually responded saying that they would follow the government line on terrorism and other charges.
Well, you mentioned earlier, if I may, Sharif, you mentioned earlier the possibility of a pardon. Mohammed Fahmi's lawyer, Amal Clooney, is calling for President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to pardon the Al Jazeera journalists.
The verdict today sends a very dangerous message in Egypt. It sends a message that journalists can be locked up for simply doing their job, for telling the truth and reporting the news. And it sends a dangerous message that there are judges in Egypt who will allow their courts to become instruments of political oppression and propaganda.
Well, one of the problems here, Sue Turton, is the fact that any appeal process is still staying within a judicial system that has been proved patently flawed. What would your step next be?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, the Court of Cassation was so clear earlier this year. This appeal court found that really the guy shouldn't have even been arrested, never mind about found guilty, and that it should never have been brought to court. But of course, the appeal court is totally unpolitical, and we all knew that before we went into here. So we all expected a positive outcome from that court. But as you say, we're now back in a system that's going to go back to the appeal court. Are we then now looking at a retrial on the retrial? Well, why should we expect anything more positive to come out than what's just happened? I really do now think that the only hope for us as a wider collective is a pardon. I think there's a chance that Mohamed Fahmy might be deported to Canada. I don't see how the Egyptians can refuse to do that when they deported Peter Greste to Australia. So what's the reasoning for not sending the Canadian home? That, of course, leaves Baha Mohammed. Baha Mohammed has nowhere else to go. He is Egyptian. So we have to keep the fight up for him. But I do think that the only real outcome for this, to get them out of jail now and hopefully to get all our convictions quashed, has to be the president. He has to say, we need to get rid of this, and he has to give a pardon out to all of us. And that must be the pressure, I think, from now on. I'm really at a loss as to what we can do with a campaign that we haven't already done. So the only thing I think we can now do is appeal to the president to say, you have to recognise these are journalists and we were all just doing our jobs, and you have to, with a swipe of the pen, free them and put this whole thing behind us.
Well, Sharif Mansour, President El-Sisi has stated repeatedly that, and I quote, he does not want to interfere with the judicial process. Are there any possibilities that calls for a pardon from him would in any way be listened to?
Well, he said that he will interfere once the legal measures have been exhausted, and that's when we are right now. I think the Court of Cassation have already given an opinion on this, and there was nothing to justify the retrial in the first place. They should have been released, but we all waited for this trial to continue just for the mere fact that we want to see if there is any evidence in the case that would justify keeping this trial going. And because honestly, seeking a pardon in a way is also a recognition of some sort that there was any reason for those journalists to be guilty, and that's something we didn't want to happen. We don't want this precedent to continue, and we don't want this to be a legitimate way in order for the government to use against any other journalist, so that they just keep them in those litigation process until a pardon is used. So it's not an ideal situation. It's not something that we like to see happen anymore, but it's at least something that helps us in the interim resolve this case. And I think it's as much pressure as we can put in the immediate period, the soonest we can put forward as much pressure in the international community, the soonest President El-Sisi will intervene.
Well, at that point, my thanks to our guests, Sharif Mansour and Sue Turton. And remember, too, the thousands of others in Egypt who've been imprisoned following similar travesties of justice. We'll leave you now with Baha Mohammed's final tweet in the course of the day. Keep shouting for us, my colleagues. I'm sorry, from now on, we'll not be able to keep in touch with you. Hashtag free AJ staff. He will not be able to keep in proper touch with his wife and children either, the youngest of whom was born while he was in prison and turned 1 the day before his father was returned to a cell. Now's the time to keep on fighting. You can join our online campaign. Tweet us at AJ Inside Story with a hashtag free AJ staff. Thank you for watching. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.